From unbreakable allies to uncertain adversaries, the story of how China and Russia's relationship crumbled has sent shockwaves through the global community. In this deep dive, we'll reveal the explosive events that triggered one of the most significant geopolitical shifts of our time, and why it matters to every one of us. We'll take you behind closed doors to expose the real reasons behind this stunning fallout. From secret economic tensions to military miscalculations that changed everything. You'll discover how ancient historical grievances finally boiled over, and why experts are calling this the end of an era in global politics. But the implications go far beyond just these two nations. We'll show you how this diplomatic earthquake is reshaping everything from international trade to military alliances, and why Western powers are scrambling to adapt to this new reality. The fate of powerful blocs like BRICS hangs in the balance, and the ripple effects are already being felt from Washington to Brussels. Whether this rift is temporary or permanent, one thing is clear: the world order as we know it is changing before our eyes. Join us as we uncover the full story of how two global giants went from partners to rivals, and what it means for our future. The story of China and Russia's relationship is one of history's most fascinating diplomatic roller coasters. These two giants share the world's longest land border, and their relationship has swung dramatically between close alliance and bitter rivalry over the centuries. In the 1600s, as Russian explorers pushed east and the Chinese Ming dynasty expanded north, the two empires first clashed over territorial disputes. This culminated in the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689, the first treaty between China and a European power, setting their initial boundaries. The 20th century brought perhaps the most dramatic chapter in their relationship. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union became the Chinese Communist Party's ideological mentor, with Mao Zedong famously declaring in 1949 that China would lean to one side, toward the Soviet Union. Moscow poured resources, technology, and expertise into building China's industrial base. Thousands of Soviet advisors helped shape everything from China's military to its education system. But this unbreakable friendship shattered spectacularly in the 1960s. Ideological differences, personal rivalries between Mao and Khrushchev, and competing claims to communist leadership led to the Sino-Soviet split. Border clashes erupted, and for 2 decades, these communist giants stood on the brink of war. This period saw China even warming up to the United States as a counterbalance to Soviet power, a dramatic shift that reshaped Cold War dynamics. The modern alliance began taking shape after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. Both nations, feeling increasingly pressured by Western dominance, found common ground in opposing what they saw as U.S. hegemony. This culminated in what they called a no-limits partnership, announced just weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The declaration promised deep cooperation across everything from space exploration to military technology, with both nations vowing to create a new global order to counter Western influence. Recent years saw unprecedented levels of cooperation. Joint military exercises became routine, trade soared to record levels, and both nations backed each other in international forums. China supported Russia's positions on NATO expansion, while Russia endorsed China's stance on Taiwan. They collaborated on alternative payment systems to reduce reliance on the US dollar, and worked together on ambitious projects like the Power of Siberia pipeline. Yet, as we'll see, beneath this facade of unity, cracks were beginning to form that would soon challenge this seemingly unshakable alliance. The facade of unity between China and Russia began cracking in ways few could have predicted. Despite their no-limits partnership, China's actions spoke louder than words. Beijing's careful diplomatic dance, verbally supporting Moscow while quietly distancing itself from Russia's military actions, revealed the first signs of strain. As international sanctions hammered Russia's economy, China saw an opportunity to leverage its position. But this calculated move would prove to be a double-edged sword. Economic tensions emerged as the first major fault line. While China continued buying Russian oil and gas, it did so at deeply discounted prices, essentially strong-arming its supposedly equal partner. Russian technology companies, desperate for microchips and components, found themselves paying premium prices to Chinese suppliers who now held all the cards. This economic power imbalance began shifting their relationship from partnership to dependency, something that didn't sit well with Moscow's self-image as a global power. Military cooperation, once a cornerstone of their alliance, began showing serious cracks. Joint exercises, though continuing for show, became increasingly hollow as China scaled back meaningful participation. More worryingly for Moscow, Chinese military officials began privately expressing concerns about the effectiveness of Russian military equipment that had previously been a major export to China. The war in Ukraine had exposed critical weaknesses in Russian military technology, leading China to accelerate development of its own indigenous weapons systems. Behind closed doors, diplomatic tensions reached boiling point over several key issues. China's growing influence in Central Asia, traditionally Russia's backyard, created serious friction. Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative was effectively pushing Russia to the margins in regions it once dominated. Additionally, China's deepening relationships with former Soviet states alarmed Moscow, particularly as these nations began looking to Beijing rather than Moscow for economic leadership. Third parties played a crucial role in accelerating the deterioration. India's strategic positioning between the two powers, the United States' diplomatic maneuvering, and the European Union's economic initiatives all contributed to widening the rift. Particularly significant was Kazakhstan's decision to strengthen ties with China while distancing itself from Moscow, a move that symbolized a broader shift in the region's power dynamics. The final straw came when leaked diplomatic cables revealed China's internal assessment of Russia as a declining power whose usefulness as an ally was diminishing. This assessment, never meant for public consumption, exposed the fundamental inequality in their relationship and the growing strategic divergence between these two powers. What had started as hairline cracks in their alliance had now become unbridgeable chasms. The economic aftershocks of the China-Russia split have sent tremors through the global financial system. What was once a $190 billion trade relationship began unraveling at an unprecedented pace. Chinese tech giants like Huawei and Xiaomi, which once saw Russia as a crucial market, started quietly scaling back operations. Meanwhile, Russian businesses scrambled to find alternative suppliers for everything from consumer electronics to industrial machinery, leading to severe supply shortages and price increases across the Russian economy. The energy sector, long considered the backbone of Russo-Chinese economic cooperation, faced its own seismic shifts. The Power of Siberia pipeline, once heralded as a symbol of their partnership, became a point of contention. China, wielding its position as Russia's largest energy customer, began demanding even steeper discounts on oil and gas imports. Russian energy giants like Gazprom and Rosneft, already struggling under Western sanctions, found themselves caught between accepting China's terms or losing their biggest market. This power play effectively ended Russia's dreams of being an equal partner in the energy relationship. Perhaps the most significant economic impact came in the currency and financial sectors. The ambitious plan to create a BRICS alternative to the SWIFT payment system began falling apart as China pushed for its digital yuan to dominate international transactions. Russian hopes of using yuan-based trade to bypass Western sanctions were dashed as Chinese banks, fearful of secondary sanctions, began restricting services to Russian clients. The ruble, already weakened, faced new pressures as Chinese investors pulled back from Russian markets. Joint projects worth billions began grinding to a halt. The much-anticipated Moscow-Kazan high-speed railway, which was to be a showcase of Chinese rail technology in Russia, was indefinitely suspended. Chinese investment in Russian Arctic development projects, once seen as a key area of cooperation, dropped dramatically. What's more, Chinese companies began quietly selling their stakes in Russian oil and gas projects, signaling a strategic retreat from long-term investments in Russia. The ripple effects on global supply chains have been profound. Asian manufacturing hubs that relied on both Chinese components and Russian raw materials found themselves forced to choose sides. Countries like Vietnam and Malaysia scrambled to restructure their supply networks. The semiconductor industry faced particular disruption, as Chinese restrictions on technology exports to Russia impacted everything from automobile production to consumer electronics. Even countries not directly involved in the dispute felt the impact as global prices for commodities like nickel, aluminum, and rare earth elements fluctuated wildly. This economic decoupling has forced a fundamental reorganization of global trade patterns. Russia's pivot to alternative partners like India and Iran has proven insufficient to replace Chinese economic might. Meanwhile, China's aggressive push into new markets, particularly in Central Asia and Africa, has left Russia increasingly isolated in regions it once considered its economic domain. The end result is a new economic world order, where the old certainties of Sino-Russian cooperation no longer apply. The military implications of this falling out between Russia and China have reshaped the security landscape of Eurasia. Joint military exercises, once a powerful symbol of their alliance, have been quietly scaled back or canceled entirely. The annual Vostok exercises, which once saw thousands of Chinese troops training alongside Russian forces in Siberia, have been reduced to mere ceremonial displays. Behind this public facade, military intelligence sharing between the two nations has virtually ceased, marking a dramatic shift from their previous deep cooperation. Border tensions, dormant for decades, have begun to resurface along the world's longest land border. Both nations have increased their military presence in sensitive regions, particularly along the Amur River and in Russia's Far East. Chinese drones have been spotted with increasing frequency near Russian territory, while Russia has deployed additional S-400 air defense systems along its eastern frontier. This military buildup marks a return to the cautious posturing of the Cold War era, with both sides watching each other warily across their shared 300-kilometer border. The arms trade, once a cornerstone of their military relationship, has virtually collapsed. Russia's position as China's primary supplier of advanced military technology has been severely undermined by the poor performance of Russian equipment in Ukraine. Chinese military analysts have been particularly scathing in their assessment of Russian combat vehicles and air defense systems. More concerning for Moscow, China has not only ceased new arms purchases, but has begun competing directly with Russia in the global arms market, offering its own advanced weapons systems to traditional Russian clients like Egypt and Algeria. In the broader Asian theater, this split has triggered a massive strategic realignment. Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam have observed these developments with intense interest, recalculating their own security positions. India, traditionally reliant on Russian military technology while wary of Chinese expansion, has found itself in a particularly complex position. The Indo-Pacific region has become a new focal point of military tension, with China aggressively expanding its naval presence while Russia struggles to maintain its influence in the region. Perhaps most concerning are the implications for nuclear deterrence. The breakdown of military cooperation has led to increased uncertainty about nuclear protocols and crisis management procedures between these two nuclear powers. Russia's hints about tactical nuclear weapon deployments near its eastern borders have been met with unusually sharp warnings from Beijing. The collapse of information sharing about nuclear forces and missile defense systems has created dangerous blind spots in both nations' strategic planning. This military decoupling has created a security vacuum that various powers are rushing to fill. Chinese military technology, once heavily influenced by Russian designs, is rapidly advancing beyond its former mentor. Meanwhile, Russia's military focus has shifted dramatically westward, leaving its eastern regions potentially vulnerable. This new military reality has forced smaller Asian nations to reconsider their security arrangements, leading to a complex web of new defense partnerships and mutual security guarantees that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. The deterioration of the China-Russia alliance has fundamentally reshaped global power dynamics, creating a new and complex international chessboard. The United States, initially caught off guard by this geopolitical earthquake, has found itself in an unprecedented position. Rather than facing a united front of two powerful adversaries, Washington now navigates a more nuanced landscape where Beijing and Moscow increasingly compete for global influence rather than coordinate their actions. U.S. diplomatic efforts have shifted from countering a unified challenge to managing two distinct rivals who are themselves deeply suspicious of each other. The European Union has emerged as a surprisingly influential player in this new global order. Brussels has leveraged the Sino-Russian split to strengthen its own position, particularly in energy markets once dominated by Russian supplies. European leaders have crafted a sophisticated approach that combines economic engagement with China while maintaining pressure on Russia. This has led to a remarkable shift in Eurasian trade patterns, with European technology and investment increasingly flowing eastward through new corridors that bypass Russian territory. NATO's strategic playbook has undergone a complete rewrite in response to these changes. The alliance has moved beyond its traditional focus on Russian deterrence to develop new capabilities aimed at addressing Chinese military expansion. Training exercises have been redesigned to account for scenarios where Russia and China might act independently or even at cross purposes. This strategic shift has also led to closer cooperation with Indo-Pacific partners, effectively extending NATO's influence well beyond its traditional North Atlantic focus. Perhaps the most dramatic changes are unfolding in the Indo-Pacific region. Countries that once carefully balanced their relationships with both China and Russia are now making clearer strategic choices. Japan and South Korea have strengthened their security partnerships with the United States, while Southeast Asian nations increasingly look to Washington as a stabilizing force in the region. India, historically close to Russia but wary of China, has emerged as a crucial swing state in this new alignment, carefully leveraging its position to maximize its diplomatic and economic advantages. This new global architecture has created both opportunities and risks. While the threat of a coordinated Sino-Russian challenge to Western interests has diminished, the potential for miscalculation has increased as each power pursues its interests more aggressively. The world is witnessing the emergence of a more fluid, multipolar order where traditional alliances are being tested and new partnerships are forming in unexpected ways. The fracturing of the China-Russia partnership has sent shockwaves through international organizations, particularly those where both nations played leading roles. BRICS, once heralded as a potential counterweight to Western-dominated institutions, now faces an existential crisis. The group's ambitious plans for a shared currency and alternative financial system have stalled as China and Russia jockey for influence within the bloc. India, Brazil, and South Africa find themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position, forced to navigate between Chinese economic might and Russian diplomatic pressure. The recent expansion of BRICS to include new members has only complicated these dynamics, as these nations must now choose sides in the emerging China-Russia rivalry. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, originally created to showcase Sino-Russian cooperation in Central Asia, has been transformed into an arena of competition. Chinese initiatives within the SCO increasingly bypass Russian interests, particularly in areas of economic development and security cooperation. Central Asian members, once deferential to Moscow's leadership, have begun openly aligning with Beijing's vision for the region. The organization's security arrangements, previously centered on joint China-Russia military exercises, have been quietly restructured to emphasize bilateral partnerships with China. China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has taken on new significance in this altered landscape. What was once a collaborative effort with Russia to reshape Eurasian trade routes has become a tool for Chinese economic dominance. New BRI corridors are being planned that deliberately circumvent Russian territory, particularly through Central Asia and the Caucasus. Russian attempts to promote its own Eurasian Economic Union as an alternative have struggled to gain traction, as nations increasingly view Chinese investment as more reliable and substantial. We're witnessing the emergence of new alliance patterns that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Middle Eastern nations, traditionally balancing between Moscow and Beijing, are forming closer ties with China while maintaining strategic distance from Russia. A new network of security arrangements is emerging in Asia, with countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines seeking closer ties with Western powers to balance against both Chinese and Russian influence. Even traditionally neutral states are being drawn into these new alignment patterns, forced to choose sides in an increasingly polarized international environment. The United Nations Security Council has become a theater for this new rivalry, with China and Russia no longer coordinating their vetoes or diplomatic positions. Their diverging stances on international crises have created new opportunities for Western diplomacy, but have also led to increased paralysis in global governance. Routine Security Council meetings have become tense affairs, with Chinese and Russian representatives openly contradicting each other on issues from peacekeeping missions to sanctions regimes. This new dynamic has prompted calls for UN reform, as the traditional power balance that governed the Security Council for decades no longer reflects geopolitical realities. The ripple effects of these changes continue to reshape international institutions. The World Trade Organization faces new challenges as China and Russia pursue competing trade frameworks. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank are adapting to a landscape where Chinese and Russian economic interests no longer align. Even seemingly apolitical organizations like the World Health Organization and International Olympic Committee find themselves navigating increasingly complex political waters as the former allies pursue competing agendas on the global stage. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more geopolitical stories. With that said, thanks for watching.